not an orthodox contribution to your series, because I do not come from a theoretical background. I have no qualifications in political sciences or social sciences, apart from writing a whole load of stuff on them. And in a way, I'm much more interested in bringing in the idea of visions of the future in terms of scenario building and how different elements in society can respond to that. Because as you might see if you've seen the notice for this talk, I've clung on to, I mean, I did French and German literature at Oxford, and I come to, like some crab scuttle sideways, I scuttled sideways like a crab along the beach of the human sciences into political and social sciences, anthropology, and all sorts of other stuff. But my starting point and my base for everything I feel and know is really literature and poetry rather than theory. So I apologize for not theorizing a lot. But when I heard the title of the series, a couple of quotes came to mind, and I put them in the description of the talk. One is, I mean, they're both cliches in a way. One is from T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men, 1925, the author of The Wasteland, trying to make sense of the interwar period, which gave birth to visions of society, communist visions, Nazi visions, fascist visions. You could see in the New Deal the embryo of a liberal, democratic, liberal capitalist vision. But in fact, the interwar period was characterized by a lot of pre-visionary feelings about decadence and rebirth and collapse. It was an age of the bestseller, The Decline of the West, which sounds much more sonorous in German. Der Untergang des Abendlandes means the metaphor is that of a setting sun, il tramonto in Italian. The sun of the West is going down. And this is a cyclic theory. Civilizations come and go. In Britain, we think about Toynbee, that nobody's ever heard of abroad, but Vico in Italy, etc. If you're linked into a concept of time, of cyclic time, then there's periods of rise and fall. And that informs your vision. And my take on nearly all the so-called ideological visions of the world is that they're all based in a cultural vision, which is often subliminal, which is the sedimentation of the ideology or the theory. And that can be said about medieval Christian philosophy or whatever. There's always a substratum. Well, my substratum is really a literary one when I hear the phrase visions of the future. And I do go back to the interwar period. And I think lots of people, when they're obsessed with whether Trump is a fascist or not, is actually subconsciously going back to the trauma of the interwar period, when the great project of Western civilization and progress fell apart visibly and in a sentient way. And I do think that, I mean, I'm very old, I'm nearly 80, and I was born in 1948, which was an extraordinary year for India, for Israel, for the United Nations, etc., keeps coming back. And I can look back and realize that though I lived in the shadow of the Cold War, and I even remember a guy coming to my school and one of the things to talk about the nuclear threat, and we were all given a calculator of how many people would die according to the proximity of the explosion. And I took this home when I was like 13, and it was just mind-boggling. At the time, the Prevent and Survive, what was it called? The famous pamphlet said, get under the table and whitewash your windows, which is quite difficult to do both at the same time. But I mean, I lived in this very abstract threat, which is wonderfully summed up in Dr. Strangelove about the nuclear threat. And then in the 1990s, I did probably give into the myth that we were going into, not the Fukuyama myth, which is inanity, but the idea that we'd got some big roadblock to progress, human progress out of the way with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we were entering a phase of some sort of progress. I mean, perhaps, you know, religions could lose their fanatical fringe and cooperate in some religious humanistic vision, and there could be some sort of trans-cultural humanistic vision, and we would finally set about realizing the vision of the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. And that, of course, was very quickly disabused in the West, and of course all perspectives are very localized, but I mean 9/11 did mess that up a bit, and then there was suddenly Islamism on the map, and now read on, you know, probably into your time. I mean, I'm of a previous era. So when it comes to visions or formulae, I would like to take them all back to fundamental scenarios about the human project, really. I mean, if you take a strictly evolutionary view of human place on this planet, which actually coincides beautifully with an ecological view, we are on a very fragile planet in a very fragile biosphere or biome, and we are very vulnerable as a species, and we are fouling our own nest. And if we do not sort out our ecological problems, all the other visions for the future are absolutely meaningless. I mean, they're literally, well, they're not literally at all. They're metaphorically whistling in the wind. I'm of the generation that tried to make sense of a song by Bob Dylan called "A Hard Rain Is Going to Fall." Well, the hard rain is going to fall, and so in that sense, just like when I talked to a group of hedge fund managers last week, trying to tell them that ecological collapse is very bad for the stock market, and that the whole idea of the indefinite pursuit of prosperity and good investments is all posited on the non-vulnerability of life on Earth. I mean, it's a very obvious point, but that does tend to get forgotten. So all the great schemes of the future, and my expertise is in the fascist one, but if you look at the communist one, or if you look at the capitalist one, or if you look at the technocratic one that's being given birth to in Silicon Valley, or the Muskian view, etc., they all posit certain assumptions about humanity, human nature, and our place on the planet. So when I was asked by Hannah and this very fascinating project to participate, I thought, well, this is not the time for me to show my ignorance about social science and social scientific modeling, but maybe I could chuck in a bit of literature. So one of the poems that I now fully I understand now far more than I used to, The Hollow Men. Those who have looked with death into death's other kingdom, you know, this extraordinary poem. This is written just after the Holocaust of the First World War, when European society was objectively and subjectively falling apart, where there was a real sense of cataclysm. And this was before any awareness of an ecological dimension to all this. He was writing about the fact that all the blah, blah, blah that you hear around, all the gossip and all the news items and all the stuff, and this was before social media, they are like the rat's feet on broken glass. They are just empty nothing. And when we see the world now from death's other kingdom, from the perspective of eternity, if you like, we're just full of rubbish. We're just full of emptiness. We're full of hollowness. All the stuff that's going on in terms of the evil, if you like, I know an evolutionary biologist, he lives in my road, you know, every discipline has its own time perspective. And I think that on one level, one of the great phrases in The Hollow Men, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper, is actually that resonates now. I mean, how are we going to, where are we going from this point in modernity? And when I say we, of course, that's an incredibly circumscribed we. If I was living in Sudan or in the Philippines or whatever, in parts of Russia, you know, every single we is a different we. But nevertheless, there is a collective, there is a planet, I believe, and there is a humanity, I believe. And one scenario for the future, which I think is so awful that it's not really part of any mainstream ideology, because it's not anything unless some suicidal psychopaths actually sort of dwell on it. I mean, one way we're going is just we're going to gradually collapse into more and more war and conflict, especially as resource shortages and water shortages and migration pressures mount. We are just sliding towards, sauntering towards, like Sleepwalkers, a major novel of the interwar period. The Sleepwalkers was about the lemming-like nature of humanity walking to another apocalypse, which actually did happen 15 years later in the Second World War. Now, our apocalypse is far more final, and we could be slithering towards just the self-destruction, a bit like if you could think of us self-harming at a species level. One scenario is a whimper, a catastrophic whimper, but not some great big bang. Now, of course, Eliot was writing before the invention of the atom bomb. And another scenario, which is constantly dangled before our eyes, I mean, the purported purpose of Trump being in Iran at this moment with his wonderful sidekick from that's a cowboy metaphor, Netanyahu, who is funded by Trump, of course, is to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But there is a scenario, certainly a scenario whereby it all gets out of hand and somebody does drop that crucial bomb, and it then proliferates, and a whole lot of predisposed reactions take place, and the military takes place. Back to Dr. Strangelove, and we do end with a bang. And so there are two catastrophic scenarios, which I don't know how far they're part of. I think there are some very, very bright people trying to model the implications both of the increasing chaos of the world and of the nuclear proliferation. And I don't want to do them an injustice. But the brightest of these experts tend to be bought up by the defense industry and by big business and by politics. And they then are silenced. And I'm sure a lot of the people who are the yes men of Trump and Netanyahu are very educated and very bright, far more so than the people they're advising. But this is an ancient tragedy of human beings. So there are two scenarios which you can inform with theory, but which I actually believe go far beyond any sort of theory, and they're very real. I mean, I think the reality of a nuclear catastrophe or a slide into general chaos on the planet, with so many touch points of tension between radicalized forms of different religions, radicalized forms of different political secular ideologies, and all sorts of national tensions, international tensions. It's really not unreasonable. I think the most likely scenario is a slither into the abyss. But I thought I'd throw in this famous line from Seamus Heaney, I never know how to pronounce his surname, the cure at Troy. And this is a cliche, I'm not quoting any sort of originality here. And this is the idea that there are peripeteia in human history. There are these magic turning points. I mean, a very, very trivial and pathetic one. When I was born, everybody smoked on TV, in lecture rooms, in films, etc. And now smoking is taboo. I mean, that's a very, very trivial point. There were predatory males everywhere. There was sexual exploitation everywhere. But now it's being talked about. You can point to little moments of hope where things change quite dramatically, quite quickly. Look at the shift from appeasement to rearmament in the late 1930s in Britain, for example. So if you're really trying to wring some optimism about our current situation, again, I think I'm dealing with an area of hope or vision of the future beyond the systematization by or theorization by the social sciences, which is, I know I'm off-piste at the moment. then you could actually say yes, but surely you can wring hope out of our present situation. And here I would point to a few potential sources of hope. One, and here this is an academic one. I have a colleague in Oslo called a wonderful woman called Nina Witoszek, and she's in the process, I hope, of winning a large grant to look at the role of small outgroups, outliers, in creating massive change for good. We had fairly recently in Britain a series of remarkable wreath lectures by a Dutch theorist about the role of small groups of idealists and activists and militant optimists in creating major change in the way things come about. And if we start looking at history through that lens, then we can look for pushback after Putin when he finally leaves the scene, pushback against Trump, pushback against some of the other psychopathic leaders in various countries who have a monopoly of power. And what could be a scenario, and I don't know if this is being modeled anywhere in a think tank or whatever, which will give it more legitimacy, is the idea that as the ecological and demographic crisis bites, you do reach a point where even hard-nosed capitalists, even hard-nosed totalitarian psychopaths see that their future depends on the future of the planet. And you could have a sort of benign moment. I mean, look at the way China, for all its evils as a socio-political system, is having pragmatically to address ecological issues and is probably the major force in the creation of an ecologically sustainable modern society. I mean, this could not have been anticipated during the time when Tibet was occupied in whenever it was the 50s, and it certainly was not part of orthodoxy 10 years ago. So if you were being optimistic, or you were with a whole load of fellow green militant activists, you could actually say, well, no, I'm being too pessimistic, I'm being too middle class. I was once told by a green militant that because I'm so old, I mean, I'm pushing 80, my cynicism, my lack of hope is all to do with my jadedness as an old man. Well, okay, fine, may be true. I have a son, I care about my immediate family, I desperately care about the plight of millions and millions of people that never really make it into the news. And if I want to be optimistic, it's about seeing the possibility of a pushback against all the cataclysmic forces which are threatening the future, not just now of millions of people who are suffering while I talk in this comfort of an Oxford studio, my own in my house, but for the future, that there is a sort of, I mean, that wonderful phrase, Nixon's phrase, the silent majority. Maybe there is a silent majority of real human beings who really care and still love and still dance and have joy and have hope, who could, when the moment is right, they can actually turn around this ship before it crashes into the cliff. And this would be in a way, a benign form, and I'll give you an ism, of what the fascists call accelerationism. One of the most interesting ideological innovations in modern fascism, neo-fascism, is the idea that if the world, the only way fascism can then now take over the world again is when the present system collapses. So anything that destabilizes the present system needs to be promoted. So general mayhem, generally speaking. I believe that, for example, there are a lot of Christian dispensationalists who are waiting for the apocalypse, who also have their own form of religious accelerationism. Well, I'm going to chuck into this project called Visions of the Future a benign version of accelerationism, which actually says, maybe as this whole system collapses and it can no longer be denied, and the Wizard of Oz of capitalism and big politics and big pharma, etc., and big social media is proved to be hollow, or as Bob Dylan once said, even the president of the United States must sometime have to be naked. Once the myth of our modern society is exposed, maybe there will be enough groundswell of real human beings who have not lost their humanity and their compassion to come together to form a new global community. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about this in science fiction terms. There'd be an enormous pushback from all the degenerate human beings who are invested in the collapse of the world, you know, and I could list all the different people who profit from the present state, apart from oil companies and arms manufacturers and all sorts of psychopathic totalitarian leaders, but trapped in their ideology, backed up by yes men with degrees who've sold their souls to in a Faustian bargain. So they're my three scenarios I'm offering you: a slithering into the abyss, slipping down the side of the volcano into the fires of hell, an absolute bang, not a whimper, created by not an eco-catastrophe, a human-made catastrophe. I mean, there are lots of mini catastrophes, so this would be the final one. Or a scenario whereby enough things go wrong in the present state of affairs for there to be a groundswell of hope. And as Heaney says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So he's contrasting two voices, one that says there is no hope in the present human condition, do not hope on this side of the grave. And the other scenario is that we are actually, the worse it gets, green accelerationism, the closer we get to a turning point, a peripeteia, a sort of Umkehr, Umschwung, there are lots of words for it, svolta in Italian, where you suddenly move from catastrophe into something benign, which comes at the cost of millions of lives, which will be lost. Nevertheless, the other side of this, and you get it a little bit in a film like in Interstellar and lots of science fiction things, that there is hope. I hope not by living on a moon going around Saturn, but still on this Earth, which is the only Earth we've got. And I don't want to get all hippie about that, but I would say that any social theory that does not have ecology built into it is pointless, has absolutely no bearing on where we're really going. And that's the end of my rambling lecture, and I hope that I've created some backlash and pushback. Thank you very much, Hannah. Over to you.
Well, massive thanks to you, Roger. Very, very thought-provoking talk, and I really appreciate how much you weaved in the visions for the future theme. That's much appreciated. We'll move now to a Q&A function. Let me just disable the recording. There we go.